At our anniversary dinner, my husband raised a toast and laughed. 7 years wasted on a woman who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet. The guests shifted uncomfortably as I slid a folder across the table. Interesting, I said. Because this falsified company audit shows you've been embezzling for years. And those hotel receipts with my best friend Maddie just went to everyone in your contacts. The lawyers arrived with both divorce and immunity papers before dessert. But the true surprise wasn't his betrayal. It was discovering who had been helping me all along. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I wasn't always this calculating. Once I was just Chloe Barrett, the trusting marketing executive who fell in love with Max Reynolds, the charismatic financial prodigy whose ambition matched my own. We met at a charity gala where he outbid everyone for a weekend in the Hamptons. Then, immediately invited me to join him. His confidence was intoxicating. His attention made me feel chosen. After a whirlwind romance, we married at the plaza with 400 guests witnessing our perfect union. For the first few years, our partnership seemed ideal. I managed creative campaigns for luxury brands while Max climbed the ranks at Reynolds Financial Group, his family's investment firm. We purchased a brownstone in Park Slope, traveled to 6 continents, and built what everyone called a power couple lifestyle. The subtle dismissiveness began in year 3. It started with small corrections when I'd speak about his work. "That's not quite how leverage works, honey," he'd say with an indulgent smile, though I'd been correct. Or, "Let me explain this in simpler terms," even when speaking to me about marketing, my actual expertise. By year 5, Max regularly spoke over me at dinner parties, finishing my thoughts as if I couldn't articulate them properly. "What Chloe is trying to say is," became his favorite phrase. Our friends, mostly his colleagues and their partners, would nod politely while I sat with a practiced smile. I began to notice something else too. The way Max's assistant Maddie would catch my eye across the room, her expression a mixture of pity and something I couldn't quite identify. The transformation was so gradual I barely recognized it happening. The confident executive I had been was slowly replaced by a woman who second-guessed herself, who checked her opinions before voicing them, who deferred to her husband's judgment even in areas where she once excelled. "Marketing is really just psychology for the masses," Max would say dismissively when I discussed campaign strategy. "The real work happens in finance. We're moving markets, not just minds." I started declining speaking engagements and leadership, roles convinced that I wasn't as capable as I once thought. Max encouraged this retreat, suggesting I focus on supporting his career trajectory, since his income had become our primary source of financial security. The shift in our relationship dynamics coincided with changes in Max's behavior. Late nights at the office became routine. Urgent business trips materialized with little notice. His phone remained permanently locked, and he began taking calls in another room, voice lowered. The classic signs were all there, but I was too enmeshed in self-doubt to recognize them. The discovery came on a rainy Tuesday in April. I had stayed home with a migraine, the kind that had become increasingly frequent as tensions in our marriage grew. Max had rushed off that morning, forgetting his tablet on the nightstand. When it chimed with an email notification, I glanced over instinctively. The preview showed just enough. "Last night was amazing. Same room at the Greenwich next week? M." My stomach dropped as I picked up the tablet. I shouldn't have swiped it. "Open." But Max had always used the same password for everything. My birthday. A twisted sentiment that now felt like mockery. The email opened to reveal a thread between Max and Maddie, my so-called friend who had been my husband's executive assistant for the past 3 years. The woman who had helped plan our anniversary, parties who had sent me thoughtful gifts when I was ill, who had listened sympathetically when I confided my concerns about my failing marriage. I scrolled through months of messages, each more intimate than the last. Explicit photos, detailed accounts of their encounters, plans for a future that didn't include me. Chloe still has no idea, Max had written, too caught up in her little marketing campaigns to notice what's happening right under her nose. I set the tablet down carefully, as if it might detonate if handled too roughly. The pain behind my eyes intensified as I moved to my home office and locked the door. For hours, I sat motionless, staring at the framed photos of our life together. Pictures that now seemed like elaborate props in a performance I hadn't realized I was part of. When the tears finally came, they weren't the desperate sobs I expected, but quiet streams that carried away the last vestiges of the woman I had allowed myself to become. By evening, something had shifted inside me, a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I opened my laptop and created a new folder titled Project Restoration. Inside, I started a document and typed my first entry. April 15th, Discovery Day. Evidence of affair with Monsieur beginning documentation phase. The next morning, I called in sick for the first time in 3 years. While Max was at work, I began a methodical search of our home. In his desk drawer, beneath false-bottomed files, I found hotel receipts, handwritten notes, and a small jewelry box containing a diamond bracelet with an inscription, "For M always." Our anniversary was in 2 months. The bracelet was clearly not intended for me. But nestled alongside these personal betrayals were unexpected discoveries. Financial documents with concerning discrepancies, copies of wire transfers to offshore accounts, and a USB drive containing spreadsheets with dual reporting systems. One official, one showing significantly different numbers. I photographed everything, careful to return items exactly as I found them. That night, I smiled through dinner as Max recounted his exhausting day of client meetings, knowing he had actually spent 3 hours at the Greenwich Hotel with his assistant. "You seem different," he remarked as we prepared for bed. "More relaxed." "Just gained some perspective today," I replied, maintaining eye contact until he looked away first. For the first time in years, I slept deeply, unburdened by the weight of not measuring up to an impossible standard. I had found a new purpose, not to save my marriage, but to save myself while ensuring Max faced consequences for his choices, both the personal and professional ones. The next day, I reached out to an old college friend, Reagan Sullivan, now a partner at a prestigious law firm specializing in both high-asset divorces and financial crimes. Our meeting was arranged under the guise of catching up over lunch, a normal activity that wouldn't trigger Max's suspicions if he happened to check my calendar or credit card statements. "It's been too long," Reagan said, embracing me at an out-of-the-way bistro 20 miles from our neighborhood. Her smile faded as she took in my expression. "What's wrong, Chloe? You sounded strange on the phone." I placed my phone on the table between us, screen displaying a photo of Max and Maddie entering the Greenwich Hotel. "I need legal advice," I said quietly. "And I think I may have uncovered something bigger than just an affair." The cafe's ambient noise provided perfect cover as I laid out what I'd discovered for Reagan. Her expression remained professionally neutral, but I caught the slight widening of her eyes when I mentioned the dual accounting system. "This isn't just about divorce," she said finally, keeping her voice low. "What you're describing could potentially be securities fraud, embezzlement, maybe even money laundering, depending on where those offshore transfers are going." I pushed the USB drive across the table. "I made a copy. Everything I've found so far is on here." Reagan discreetly pocketed it. "I'll have my financial forensics team look at this. In the meantime, you need to be extremely careful. If Max suspects you know anything about the affair, or especially the financial irregularities, it could complicate everything." "I've thought about that," I said, taking a sip of water to steady myself. "He believes I'm completely oblivious. Actually, he counts on it." "Use that," Reagan advised. "The more he underestimates you, the more advantage we have." Over the next 6 weeks, I perfected the art of strategic ignorance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I maintained our normal routines while secretly documenting every aspect of Max's life. I installed a keylogger on our home computer that forwarded his passwords to a secure email I'd created. I placed a small recording device in his home office, capturing conversations with business partners that grew increasingly concerning. The Reynolds Fund audit is next month, Max had told someone named Nicholas on a Tuesday evening call. We need to clean up the discrepancies before then. Move another $2 million through the Jakarta account, then route it back through the charity foundation. I forwarded recordings to Reagan, who confirmed my suspicions. Max wasn't just embezzling from his clients. He was using his family's charitable foundation to launder money. The betrayal extended far beyond our marriage. He was betraying his family legacy, his clients' trust, and possibly breaking federal laws. We need to approach this carefully, Reagan cautioned during one of our secure calls. The evidence you're gathering could be invaluable, but only if collected legally. She connected me with a digital forensics specialist named Arlo Fleming, a no-nonsense woman with a cybersecurity background who helped me establish secure communication channels and proper evidence collection protocols. One-party consent recording is legal in your state, Arlo explained during our first meeting at Reagan's office. But accessing his email without permission is murky territory. We need to focus on what you can legally obtain. With Arlo's guidance, I refined my approach. I began asking innocent questions about Max's work when he was distracted or slightly intoxicated, recording his explanations about investment strategies that sounded legitimate on the surface, but revealed problematic patterns when analyzed by experts. "You're actually interested in this stuff now?" Max had asked one evening, amused by my questions about the family foundation's investment portfolio. I'd shrugged casually. I was thinking about getting more involved in the charitable side. It would look good for both of us, don't you think? The power couple giving back. His ego couldn't resist the opportunity to explain, in what he thought were oversimplified terms, exactly how the foundation maximized its impact through strategic financial management. In reality, he was outlining exactly how he disguised fraudulent transactions. As our 7th anniversary approached, the evidence mounted. Reagan had assembled a comprehensive file documenting years of financial misconduct. The revelation about Maddie, while personally devastating, had become almost secondary to the larger crimes I was helping uncover. The SEC would be very interested in what we've found, Reagan said during our final planning meeting. But I want to be clear about something, Chloe. Once we move forward, there's no turning back. This will likely result in criminal charges against Max. Are you prepared for that? I considered her question carefully. Despite everything, there had been good years with Max. Moments of genuine connection. Dreams we'd built together. He made his choices, I said finally. Now I'm making mine. The turning point came 3 days before our anniversary when I discovered something I hadn't anticipated. While organizing files for Reagan, I found an email thread between Max and his father, John Reynolds. The exchanges revealed that John had suspected financial irregularities months ago and had quietly launched an internal investigation. "This complicates things," Reagan observed when I showed her the emails. "If his father already suspects something, it changes nothing," insisted. "If anything, it confirms we're on the right track." But that night, as I lay awake beside my sleeping husband, a new plan began to form, one that would require perfect timing and one additional ally I hadn't considered. The next morning, I made a call that felt both terrifying and necessary. "Mr. Reynolds, this is Chloe. I need to speak with you privately. It's about Max and the company." We met in Central Park, 2 people connected by a man who had betrayed us both in different ways. John Reynolds looked older than he had at our wedding, his commanding presence somewhat diminished by worry lines and a certain weariness in his eyes. "I've suspected for some time," he said after I outlined what I'd discovered. "But I needed proof that wouldn't be dismissed as a father's overprotectiveness or age-related paranoia. The board has been challenging my concerns." "I have that proof," I told him, "and I have a proposal for how we handle this, together." As we talked, our plan took shape, one that would address both the personal and professional betrayals, while protecting the company John had spent his life building. By the time we parted, we had agreed on every detail, including the most important one. Max would never see it coming. The night before our anniversary dinner, I sat at my vanity, studying my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't the same one who had discovered her husband's betrayal 6 weeks ago. She was calmer, more focused, with a quiet confidence that no dismissive comment could diminish. La Maison Azur gleamed under soft lighting when I arrived precisely 30 minutes early. Max had insisted on hosting our 7th anniversary dinner at the most exclusive restaurant in the city, a place that typically required reservations months in advance, unless you were Max Reynolds with the right connections and an unlimited budget. "Mrs. Reynolds," the maitre d' greeted me with practiced deference. "Your husband has arranged everything. The Sapphire Room awaits." I followed him through the main dining area, past curious glances and appreciative gazes. I'd chosen my outfit carefully, a midnight blue dress that Max had once described as acceptable for a corporate wife, but that I knew highlighted every curve he'd taken for granted. My grandmother's pearls adorned my neck, a reminder of the women in my family who had endured and overcome their own hardships. The private dining room took my breath away despite my mental preparation. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across a long table adorned with white orchids and silver accents. Place cards with calligraphied names marked each setting, with Max and me positioned at the head of the table. 40 guests would witness what I had planned, a carefully curated audience of business associates, family members, and friends. I brushed my fingers across my clutch, feeling the outline of the USB drive containing every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Identical copies had already been secured with Reagan and delivered to specific authorities earlier that day. There was no turning back. John Reynolds arrived first, 15 minutes before the scheduled start time, exactly as we had planned. "You look lovely, Chloe," he said, embracing me with genuine warmth. To any observer, it was simply a father-in-law greeting his daughter-in-law on a special occasion. Only we knew about the small data device he slipped into my hand during the embrace, the final piece of evidence I needed. "Is everything in place?" I whispered. He nodded imperceptibly. "Board members are all here. Nicholas canceled last minute. Apparently he's having an attack of conscience. Nicholas Wright, Max's closest friend and business partner. His absence was noteworthy but wouldn't derail our plans." "And Margaret?" I asked, referring to Max's mother. "She'll be here. She deserves to see this for herself." Guests began arriving in waves. Business associates clustered together, exchanging industry gossip while eyeing the premium liquor at the open bar. My side was noticeably smaller, just a few college friends and my sister who had flown in from Seattle. The disparity no longer bothered me. It simply highlighted how much of myself I had surrendered to become Mrs. Reynolds. At precisely 7:30, Max made his entrance. He looked handsome in his tailored suit, his confident smile never reaching his eyes as he surveyed the room with the satisfaction of a man who believed himself untouchable. He moved through the crowd with practiced charm, shaking hands and clapping shoulders, before finally making his way to me. "You look nice," he said, brushing a perfunctory kiss against my cheek. "The Robinson deal is here tonight. Try to be engaging but not too opinionated, okay? I need this to go smoothly." "Of course," I replied with the accommodating smile he expected. "Whatever you need." He studied me for a moment, perhaps sensing something different in my tone, but was quickly pulled away by an eager investment banker. I watched him work the room, noting how he spent extra time with the men who controlled the most money and the least with those of lower status. His hierarchy was always so transparent once. You knew how to see it. Maddie arrived at 7:45, technically invited as Max's executive assistant, but actually there as his lover. She avoided my gaze as she slipped into a seat at the far end of the table. Margaret Reynolds arrived last, her entrance causing a subtle ripple through the crowd. Unlike her husband, she had been kept in the dark about our plan. She embraced me stiffly, her smile not quite disguising her concern. "How are you holding up, dear? These business dinners can be so tedious." "Actually, I think tonight might surprise everyone," I replied with genuine warmth. Despite our differences, I had always respected Margaret's dignity. At 8 o'clock, we were seated for dinner. Crystal clinked against fine china as conversations flowed around me. I maintained my role perfectly, asking the right questions about children and vacation homes, expressing appropriate interest in market trends and property values. Max grew increasingly animated with each glass of wine, his hand occasionally squeezing my thigh beneath the table, a possessive gesture that once would have pleased me but now made my skin crawl. Between the main course and dessert, John Reynolds stood and tapped his glass, the sound cutting through the ambient conversation. "I think it's time for a toast to the happy couple." The room quieted as everyone turned toward him. Max straightened in his chair, basking in the attention. His father was a commanding presence even in his 70s, and the room respected his authority. 7 years ago, my son made what many considered a strategic marriage, John began, his voice carrying the weight of decades leading one of the city's most prestigious financial firms, to a woman who brought beauty, intelligence, and grace to our family. Max smiled indulgently, clearly expecting the usual praise. But there was something in his father's expression, a tightness around the eyes, a certain clipped quality to his words, that made me wonder if he was beginning to sense something wasn't right. "Marriage, like business, requires honesty, integrity, and mutual respect," John continued, his gaze sweeping across the room before landing on his son. "Without those elements, everything we build is nothing but a house of cards." A subtle tension crept through the room. This was not the light-hearted anniversary toast guests had expected. "Dad," Max interjected with a nervous laugh. "Maybe save the business metaphors for the office?" John ignored him. I raised my son to understand that. The Reynolds name stands for something in this city. That trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore. He raised his glass. To 7 years of marriage, and to the truth that can no longer remain hidden. The silence that followed was deafening. Max's expression had transformed from confidence to confusion. He recovered quickly, standing to take control of the moment. "Well, that was cryptic," he laughed, raising his own glass. "Let me offer a more straightforward toast." His eyes found mine, that familiar condescending smile playing at his lips. To 7 years with a woman who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet, but who's been the perfect corporate wife nonetheless. A few uncomfortable chuckles broke the silence. Most guests seemed unsure how to react to such a backhanded compliment. I felt rather than saw John and Margaret Reynolds stiffen on either side of me. The moment had arrived. With deliberate calm, I reached for my clutch and withdrew the folder we had prepared. "I'd like to respond to that toast," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "It's interesting you should mention balance sheets," I said, sliding the folder across the table toward Max. "Considering how creative you've been with them lately." Max's smile remained fixed, but a flicker of unease crossed his eyes as he glanced at the folder without opening it. "What's this, honey? Anniversary gift? Perhaps we can save it for later." "Oh, but it can't wait," I replied, maintaining eye contact. "After all, everyone's here. Your family, your colleagues, your clients, the people who trust you." The atmosphere in the room shifted, Conversations died away as attention focused on the unexpected tension between us. Max reached for the folder, with practiced nonchalance, but I noticed the slight tremor in his fingers as he flipped it open. Inside were side-by-side comparisons of Reynolds Financial Group's official audit reports and the actual transactions I had documented. 7 years of discrepancies, all meticulously organized and annotated. Max's face drained of color as he flipped through the pages. "What is this?" he whispered, all pretense gone from his voice. "Evidence," I said simply, "of embezzlement, money, laundering through the family foundation, and securities fraud, among other things." Someone gasped. A glass shattered somewhere to my right. But I kept my eyes fixed on Max, watching the realization dawn that his carefully constructed world was collapsing. "You've misunderstood," he began, looking desperately around the table. "These are complex financial strategies that Chloe has misinterpreted. She has no background in—" "Actually," John Reynolds interrupted, rising to stand beside me, "our forensic accountants have verified everything in that report. There's no misinterpretation, son." Max stared at his father in disbelief. "You knew about this?" "Not at first," John admitted. "But I started noticing irregularities in the foundation accounts months ago. When Chloe came to me with her concerns, it confirmed what I'd begun to suspect." Max's expression hardened as he turned back to me. "You went behind my back? To my father?" "Just like you went behind mine with Maddie," I replied quietly. The room fell completely silent. All eyes turned to Maddie, who had shrunk into her chair, face flaming with humiliation. "Oh, yes," I continued, removing my phone from my clutch. "I know about the affair. The hotel meetings during client dinners. The plans you were making for after you divorced me." I tapped my phone screen once. "And now, so does everyone else in this room." Phones began chiming throughout the dining area. Guests reached for them reflexively, confusion turning to shock as they viewed the explicit messages and hotel receipts I'd discovered during my investigation. "You had no right," Max snarled, half rising from his seat. "Actually, I had every right," I countered calmly. "As your wife, as a board member of the Reynolds Foundation, and as a citizen concerned about financial crimes." His business partner, James Wilson, was already on his feet, scanning through the financial documents with growing alarm. "Max, is this accurate? The Jakarta transfers? The shell companies? This could implicate all of us." "It's being taken out of context," Max insisted, desperation edging into his voice. "This is a personal vendetta, not legitimate evidence." "Then perhaps you'll find the SEC more objective," came a new voice from the entrance to the private dining room. All heads turned to see Reagan standing in the doorway, legal briefcase in hand and 2 colleagues beside her. The restaurant had fallen eerily silent, with only the gentle classical music continuing as if nothing extraordinary was happening. "Max Reynolds," Reagan said, approaching our table with measured steps. "I'm Reagan Sullivan, representing Mrs. Reynolds in divorce proceedings." She placed a leather portfolio on the table. "These papers address the dissolution of your marriage and Mrs. Reynolds's immunity agreement with federal prosecutors." "Immunity?" Max's voice cracked as the implications sank in. "For her full cooperation in the investigation into Reynolds Financial Group's fraudulent activities," Reagan explained professionally. "The evidence she provided has been instrumental in uncovering systemic fraud that might otherwise have gone undetected." Max's eyes darted between Reagan, his father, and me, looking for an ally and finding none. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered. "Whatever she thinks she's found is completely fabricated or misunderstood. Chloe doesn't understand the first thing, about complex financial operations." Reagan smiled thinly. "Is that so?" She removed another document from her briefcase. "Perhaps you could explain the context of this recorded conversation from March 18th, when you instructed your CFO to falsify quarterly reports. Or these emails where you discussed creating fictitious clients to justify disappearing funds." The Ein. Blood drained from Max's face. You recorded me? That's illegal. One-party consent is perfectly legal in this state, I said softly. Something you might have known if you'd ever bothered to listen when I mentioned my marketing work on compliance campaigns. Margaret Reynolds, who had remained silent until now, slowly rose from her seat. Her face was rigid with controlled emotion as she addressed her son. Maximum Reynolds IV, she said, using his full formal name for perhaps the first time since his childhood. Explain yourself. Mother, this is a misunderstanding, Max began, his voice taking on the placating tone he used when managing difficult clients. Chloe has found some routine business documents and twisted them into something sinister. Don't, Margaret cut him off sharply. I was a Reynolds before you were born. I sat on that board for 20 years before you joined it. Do not insult my intelligence by suggesting I can't recognize fraud when I see it documented in black and white. The rebuke seemed to hit Max harder than anything else that had happened. He had always counted on his mother's unconditional support and admiration. Now, watching her expression of disgust, something in him seemed to crumble. Another commotion. At the door drew everyone's attention. Two men in dark suits entered the private dining room, their expressions professionally neutral as they surveyed the scene. One held up credentials that caused several guests to murmur in alarm. FBI? Someone whispered unnecessarily. Max Reynolds? The lead agent inquired, though his gaze had already locked onto Max's frozen figure. Reagan stepped forward. As discussed, Agent Davis, Mr. Reynolds is here, and we've provided all documentation as agreed. Max's attorney, Mitchell Sanders, burst through the restaurant doors, breathing heavily as if he'd run from his car. Don't say anything, Max, he commanded, approaching our table. Too late for that advice, Reagan responded. Your client has already made several incriminating statements in front of multiple witnesses. As the agents approached Max, the reality of his situation seemed to finally register. His eyes found mine across the table, burning with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Why like this? He demanded, gesturing around the room. Why the public humiliation? You could have just gone to the authorities. I considered his question carefully. Because you needed to understand what you'd done, not just the financial crimes, but how you diminished me for years. Tonight wasn't just about legal justice, Max. It was about finally being seen. As the FBI agents led Max away, the remaining guests began to disperse, murmuring in shocked tones about what they'd witnessed. Business associates huddled in corners, frantically checking their phones and whispering about damage control. My small group of friends moved closer, forming a protective circle around me. John Reynolds collected his stunned wife, whose aristocratic composure had finally cracked under the weight of her son's betrayal. We'll talk tomorrow, he told me, quietly. There's much to discuss about the company's future. I nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the adrenaline was ebbing. 7 weeks of deception, planning, and constant vigilance had taken their toll. I gathered my clutch and prepared to leave, ready for the solitude of the town car waiting outside. Chloe. The voice stopped me at the door, a voice I hadn't expected to hear tonight. I turned slowly to face Joe Bennett, Max's childhood friend and former college roommate. For years, Joe had been a peripheral figure in our social circle, always invited to major events but never part of Max's inner business sphere. He'd declined a position at Reynolds Financial after graduation, choosing instead to build his own tech security firm. Joe, I acknowledged cautiously. I didn't realize you were here. He approached with measured steps, his expression unreadable. I sat at the back. Max never noticed me arrive. Something in his tone made me study him more carefully. Joe had always been quiet, observant rather than attention-seeking. While Max commanded rooms with bluster and charm, Joe analyzed from the margins. I'd always sensed an intelligence in him that Max either didn't recognize or deliberately downplayed. We're You recording? I asked suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. For evidence? A slight smile crossed his face. I have been for nearly a year. My mind raced through implications. You knew? About the fraud? Joe gestured toward a corner table where we could speak privately. Once seated, he leaned forward, voice low. 3 years ago, Max approached me about installing security systems for Reynolds Financial. During the process, I noticed irregularities in their network architecture. Hidden servers, unusual data encryption patterns. That doesn't necessarily mean fraud, I pointed out. No, Joe agreed. But it was enough to make me curious. I built backdoors into the security system, a standard practice to allow for maintenance, but I maintained access even after installation was complete. What I found, he shook his head. Let's just say I've been documenting everything since then. I stared at him, processing this revelation. Why didn't you go to the authorities? Insufficient evidence, he replied pragmatically. I could see data patterns suggesting fraud, but nothing concrete enough for prosecution. Then about a year ago, I noticed something else. Someone inside Reynolds Financial was also tracking the irregularities, collecting evidence. John, I said immediately. Joe shook his head. That was my assumption too, but the digital trail didn't match his access patterns or technical abilities. This was someone with limited official access but considerable determination, someone using creative workarounds to document the fraud. Realization dawned slowly. Me? You were tracking me? Not at first, Joe clarified. I was tracking the fraud investigation, which led me to your activities. When I realized it was you, he hesitated. I began supplementing your evidence gathering, filling gaps, ensuring the chain of custody would hold up in court. My mind reeled as I processed his words. The email password changes that happened, just when I needed them. The mysterious system access grants that shouldn't have been possible with my credentials. Joe nodded once. Like I said, I built the security system. You've been helping me all along, I whispered, stunned by the revelation. Consider it atonement, he said quietly. I should have recognized what Max was becoming years ago. We all should have. Instead, everyone enabled him. His parents by believing he could do no wrong. His business partners by turning blind eyes to ethical shortcuts. Me by remaining silent when I discovered the fraud. And me, I added softly, by allowing him to diminish me until I almost believed it myself. For a moment, we sat in contemplative silence, two people who had orbited Max Reynolds's magnetic field for years before breaking free in their own ways. There's something else you should know, Joe said finally. The FBI didn't just show up tonight because of your evidence or Reagan's coordination. They've had an ongoing investigation into several investment firms, including Reynolds Financial. Your evidence was the final piece they needed, but this goes beyond Max. Nicholas Wright, I said immediately, remembering his conspicuous absence tonight. Joe raised an eyebrow, impressed. Yes. Nicholas turned state's evidence 3 days ago. He's been working with federal prosecutors to implicate several major players in the industry. Max was actually a smaller fish in a much larger pond of corruption. The revelation should have shocked me, but somehow it made perfect sense. Max's inflated ego would never allow him to see himself as anything but the mastermind, even when he was just another cog in a larger machine. Is that why you're here tonight? I asked. As part of the federal investigation? Joe hesitated before answering. Partly. I've been a confidential informant for the past 6 months, but I also came because… He paused, choosing his words carefully. I wanted to see you take your power back. Something in his expression, open admiration without a hint of patronization, made me see Joe Bennett in an entirely new light. Had he always looked at me this way, while I was too enmeshed in Max's orbit to notice? So what happens now? I asked, suddenly aware of how unprepared I was for life after tonight. All my planning had focused on this confrontation, with little thought to what would follow. "That depends," Joe replied. "The FBI will want to interview you again, more formally. This time, the Reynolds financial scandal will dominate financial news for months. There will be lawsuits, criminal trials, regulatory investigations. And the company? John has options," Joe said thoughtfully. "With Max removed, there's a chance to salvage the legitimate parts of the business. The Reynolds name still carries weight, especially if they demonstrate full cooperation with authorities and make restitution to defrauded clients." I nodded, thinking of John's brief comment about discussing the company's future. "He'll want me involved in that process." "Because you helped expose the fraud rather than participate in it," Joe agreed. "Your marketing expertise would be valuable in rebuilding public trust." The idea was both appealing and terrifying. Stepping into a leadership role at the very firm where I'd been treated as an ornamental wife rather than a capable professional. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," Joe said, seeming to read my thoughts. "Take time to process everything that's happened." As we sat in contemplative silence, the restaurant staff discreetly began clearing the abandoned anniversary dinner. The elaborate cake, a 7-tiered masterpiece that had cost more than most people's monthly rent, remained uncut on its silver stand. 6 months after that fateful anniversary dinner, I stood at the entrance of the Reynolds Financial Group, headquarters, now renamed Reynolds Trust and Investment. The scandal had dominated financial news for weeks, then months, exactly as Joe had predicted. 3 other major investment firms had been implicated in the wider investigation, with senior executives facing serious federal charges. Max had eventually accepted a plea deal, trading testimony against bigger players for a reduced sentence. 10 years instead of 30. The last time I saw him was across a courtroom, where he sat hollow-eyed and diminished, barely resembling the confident man who had once dismissed me so casually. The marble lobby looked the same, but the company within had been transformed. John Reynolds had stepped back into the role of CEO during the crisis, implementing sweeping reforms with a transparency that industry analysts called revolutionary. Nearly half the board had been replaced, many executive positions reorganized, and an independent ethics committee established with actual enforcement powers. "Ms. Barrett," the receptionist greeted me with warm professionalism. No longer Mrs. Reynolds, I had reclaimed my maiden name along with my identity. "The board is ready for you." I adjusted my tailored suit, dark blue, crisp and commanding, and took the elevator to the top floor. The boardroom where I'd once felt like an ornamental accessory now awaited my presentation as a respected professional. John Reynolds rose to greet me as I entered. "Chloe, thank you for coming." The past months had aged him, new lines etching his face, but there was also an unburdening, the relief of secrets finally aired and addressed. "Thank you for the opportunity," I replied, setting up my presentation materials with practiced efficiency. Around the table sat the new board, a diverse group of finance professionals selected for their expertise and ethical reputations rather than their connections. Margaret Reynolds occupied a chair near her husband, her role in the company reconstruction surprisingly vital. After the initial shock, she had channeled her considerable social and business acumen into salvaging what could be saved of the Reynolds legacy. "As you know," I began once everyone was settled, "we've spent the last 3 months conducting extensive market research on public perception of financial institutions following the industry-wide scandal. For the next 40 minutes, I presented the comprehensive rebranding strategy I'd developed, not as Max's wife or the whistleblower, but as the founder and CEO of Barrett Strategic Communications, the boutique agency I had established after the dust settled. Transparency isn't just ethical, it's good business, I concluded. Our research shows that 68% of high net worth individuals would pay higher fees for demonstrably ethical investment management. The Reynolds name can become synonymous with this new paradigm, turning a crisis into an opportunity for industry leadership. The board's questions were incisive but respectful. No one spoke over me or simplified my answers, a stark contrast to the dismissive treatment I'd once accepted as normal. "Excellent work," John said when the discussion concluded. "The board will review your proposal and have a decision by next week." I gathered my materials, exchanging professional goodbyes with board members as they filed out. Margaret lingered, behind, approaching me when we were nearly alone. "I'd like to apologize," she said, her usual formality softened by sincerity. "For years, I watched Max undermine you and said nothing. I studied the woman who had once intimidated me with her old money poise and exacting standards. You didn't create that dynamic." "No, but I enabled it," she admitted. "I was raised to believe wives should defer to husbands in business matters. I applied that outdated standard to you, even as I was actively involved in Reynolds Financial. Myself. The hypocrisy is embarrassing." Her candor surprised me. "We all participated in dynamics we wouldn't choose now," I offered. "What matters is what we do going forward." She nodded, a hint of respect in her expression that had never been there during my marriage. "John tells me you've declined the board position we offered." "It doesn't feel right for me," I confirmed. "I'm building something of my own now." "Good," she said simply. "Max's greatest disservice was convincing you to make yourself smaller. I'm glad to see you've corrected that miscalculation." After leaving Reynolds headquarters, I walked the few blocks to my agency's new office space in a renovated industrial building. The open concept workspace hummed with the energy of my small but growing team, 6 professionals I'd handpicked for their talent and integrity. "How did it go?" Arlo asked, looking up from her computer. After helping document Max's crimes, she had become my head of digital strategy, her cybersecurity background proving invaluable for clients rebuilding trust in the digital space. "They seemed impressed," I replied, settling at my desk. "They'll decide next week, but I think we'll get the contract." "That would be a big win," she observed. "Rebranding the very firm you helped expose? It's poetic justice." I smiled, scanning through emails that had accumulated during my meeting. One subject line caught my attention. "Dinner tonight?" From Joe Bennett. Our relationship had evolved gradually over the months following Max's arrest. What began as strategic collaboration during the investigation had developed into friendship, then something more. Joe's quiet intelligence and genuine respect for my capabilities created a foundation entirely unlike what I'd experienced with Max. "Still on for tonight?" Reagan appeared in my office doorway, interrupting my thoughts. After representing me in the divorce, she had become both a friend and occasional legal counsel for my new business. "Absolutely," I confirmed. 7 o'clock at Lucien's. "Perfect. I want to hear everything about the Reynolds presentation," she said. "Plus, I have news about the foundation grant." The Reynolds Foundation had been restructured under Margaret's leadership, with a new focus on supporting women in business. Its first major initiative was a grant program for female entrepreneurs recovering from financial abuse, an irony not lost on anyone familiar with the Reynolds scandal. My agency had helped develop the program's messaging pro bono, my personal contribution to transforming something corrupted into something redemptive. As afternoon sunshine streamed through the windows, I opened my project management software to review the day's priorities. My phone chimed with a text from Joe. "Looking forward to tonight. P.S. The system integration for your new client is complete." I smiled, appreciating his blend of personal and professional support. Unlike Max, who had wanted me ornamental and oblivious, Joe valued my ambition and capability. Our relationship existed in partnership rather than hierarchy. The contrast between my life 6 months ago and now sometimes felt surreal. The woman who had sat quietly at dinner parties, carefully moderating her opinions, had been replaced by someone who spoke confidently in boardrooms and built her own business from the ground up. The anniversary dinner confrontation hadn't just exposed Max's betrayal, it had freed me from my own complicity in being diminished. The public revelation hadn't been about revenge as much as reclamation of my dignity, my agency, and my right to be fully seen. Later, as I prepared to leave the office, I paused to straighten the framed article hanging near my desk, a financial Times feature titled "Whistleblower Builds Ethics-Focused Agency from Ashes of Financial Scandal." The woman in the accompanying photo looked directly into the camera, her posture straight, her gaze unwavering. She looked nothing like the carefully curated corporate wife who had once occupied the margins of Max Reynolds' life. She looked like me, the real me. Finally. 1 year to the day after the anniversary dinner that had changed everything, I found myself once again preparing for an evening event. This time, however, the circumstances couldn't have been more different. The loft space of Barrett Strategic Communications was transformed for our agency's first anniversary celebration. Industrial chandeliers cast warm light over cocktail tables adorned with simple arrangements of white orchids. A string quartet played softly in the corner while catering. Staff circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres. "Everything looks perfect," Reagan said, appearing at my side in an emerald dress that complemented her confident stance. She had recently been named partner at her firm, her work on the Reynolds case establishing her as a specialist in corporate whistleblower protection. "Thanks to Margaret's event planning connections," I replied, scanning the room with satisfaction. "Who knew my former mother-in-law would become one of our most valuable networking resources?" "Life's full of surprises," Reagan mused. "Speaking of which, have you heard the latest about Nicholas Wright?" I shook my head. Nicholas had been the first to turn state's evidence in the wider financial fraud investigation, ultimately receiving the lightest sentence of all involved. "Community service completed. He's starting a compliance consulting firm," Reagan informed me. "Apparently, he's positioning himself as the reformed insider who can help companies avoid ethical pitfalls." "Clever pivot," I acknowledged, though somewhat ironic. "Very on brand for the financial world," Reagan observed dryly. "Failure repackaged as expertise." More guests began arriving. Clients, media contacts, and the network of professionals who had supported my journey from corporate wife to agency founder. Each represented a connection formed or transformed in the aftermath of Max's downfall. Arlo approached with a tablet displaying real-time social media engagement for the event hashtag. "We're trending locally," she reported with satisfaction. The Times business reporter just checked in at the door. I nodded appreciation. Media coverage had been a double-edged sword throughout the past year. My connection to the Reynolds scandal opening doors, but also threatening to overshadow my agency's work. We'd been strategic about which opportunities to embrace and which to decline. "Chloe." The familiar voice carried over the growing crowd noise. I turned to see John Reynolds, impeccably dressed as always, Margaret at his side. "John, Margaret, I'm so glad you could make it." The greeting was genuine. Our relationship had evolved into something neither of us could have anticipated during my marriage to Max. "We wouldn't miss it," John replied warmly. "Besides, the Reynolds Trust quarterly report shows clear benefits from our partnership with your agency. The numbers speak for themselves." Margaret nodded in agreement. "Trust in the Reynolds name is at 72% among high-net-worth clients, higher than before the scandal, remarkably enough." "Transparency as competitive advantage," I said, echoing the core strategy I'd developed for their rebranding. "People value honesty, even about past mistakes." "A lesson that came at great cost," John acknowledged, a shadow crossing his features. Though he never spoke of Max to me, I knew he visited his son monthly at the Federal Correctional Facility upstate. Margaret did not. As the Reynolds moved to greet other guests, Joe appeared beside me, handsome in a charcoal suit that complemented my burgundy dress. His tech security firm had expanded significantly since the Reynolds case, with corporate clients, newly concerned about internal fraud detection. "Quite a turnout," he observed, his hand resting lightly at the small of my back. "The who's who of New York business. And not a single person who knew me only as Max's wife," I noted with satisfaction. Joe smiled. "That identity has been thoroughly replaced by formidable founder and CEO." At precisely 8 o'clock, I moved to the small podium set up near the wall of windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The room quieted as I prepared to address the gathering. "Thank you all for coming tonight to celebrate Barrett Strategic's first anniversary," I began, surveying the attentive faces. 1 year ago, I had nothing but a concept, a commitment to ethical business practices, and a first-hand understanding of how quickly reputations can unravel when those practices are compromised. Subtle nods acknowledged the understated reference to the scandal that had made my name recognizable in business circles. "Many of you were instrumental in helping me transform crisis into opportunity," I continued. "You saw value in my perspective when others might have defined me solely by my connection to a highly publicized corporate fraud case." My gaze moved deliberately across key faces in the crowd. Reagan, who had protected my legal interests, Arlo, whose technical expertise had been invaluable, John and Margaret Reynolds, who had chosen redemption over denial, and finally Joe, whose belief in me had never wavered. Barrett Strategic was founded on a simple premise, that authenticity is not just an ethical choice, but a business imperative. In a world where information moves at unprecedented speed, organizations can no longer separate who they claim to be from who they truly are. I paused, letting the statement resonate. Many in the room represented companies that had learned this lesson the hard way. Our client portfolio has grown from 1 to 27 in just 12 months. We've helped organizations navigate crises, rebuild damaged reputations, and, most importantly, establish communication practices that prevent the disconnection between stated values and actual behavior. Approving murmurs rippled through the audience. Several of our success stories were represented in the room. Tonight, I'm pleased to announce Barrett Strategic's expansion into a new practice area: financial ethics communication. The announcement generated interested whispers. Led by our newest team member, whom many of you know from her previous role at the Financial Ethics Institute. I gestured toward the entrance, where a familiar figure stood. "Please welcome Margaret Reynolds to our executive team." Genuine surprise registered across the room as Margaret stepped forward, accepting the introduction with a dignified nod. Her decision to join my agency had been kept strictly confidential until this moment. Margaret brings unparalleled insight into the challenges facing financial institutions in the post-scandal landscape, I explained. Her guidance will be invaluable as we help clients navigate new regulatory requirements and heightened public expectations. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. The Reynolds family matriarch aligning herself professionally with the woman who had exposed her son's crimes. It represented the final severing of old loyalties and the formation of new ones based on shared values rather than family obligation. As Margaret joined me briefly at the podium to acknowledge the applause, I caught Joe's eye in the crowd. His expression held pride without possession, admiration without entitlement, everything that had been missing in Max's gaze. Later, as guests mingled and networked throughout the loft, I stepped onto the terrace for a moment of quiet reflection. The city stretched before me, lights glittering against the darkening sky. Somewhere in that landscape was the restaurant where, 1 year ago, I had finally stopped playing a role in someone else's story. The terrace door opened behind me, and Joe joined me at the railing. "You've accomplished something remarkable," he said, nodding toward the celebration continuing inside. "Not just a successful business, but a complete reinvention." "Not reinvention," I corrected gently. "Reclamation. Everything I am now was already there, just hidden under years of accommodation and compromise. Joe considered this. Fair distinction. Either way, it's impressive. We stood in comfortable silence, the cool evening air a pleasant contrast to the warmth of the gathering inside. I received an interesting call today, Joe said after a moment. Federal prison upstate. Seems Max wants to meet with me. I turned to study his face, surprised. Did he say why? Only that he has important information he thinks I should know. Joe's expression remained neutral. I haven't decided if I'll go. I considered this unexpected development. What does your instinct tell you? That Max Reynolds still believes he can manipulate situations to his advantage, Joe replied thoughtfully. But also that if I don't go, I'll always wonder what he wanted to say. The old Chloe might have offered people-pleasing advice or deferred to Joe's judgment entirely. The woman I had become simply nodded. You'll make the right decision either way. Behind us, the celebration continued, a testament to possibilities I couldn't have imagined when I was playing the role of the perfect corporate wife. The future stretched before me, unscripted and authentically mine. 2 weeks after Barrett Strategic's anniversary party, I sat in my office reviewing quarterly projections when my phone buzzed with a text from Joe. Just left prison. Need to talk? Dinner tonight? The message sent a flutter of unease through me. Joe had decided to visit Max after all, despite our mutual concerns about what manipulation might be behind the request. I replied with a simple 7 p.m. at my place and tried to refocus on work, though my concentration was broken. That evening, I prepared a simple meal, more as an activity to occupy my hands than from any real appetite. When Joe arrived, the tension in his shoulders told me everything I needed to know before he spoke a word. That bad? I asked, pouring him a glass of wine. Joe accepted it gratefully. Complicated, he corrected, loosening his tie. Max has changed. Prison has stripped away much of his arrogance, though not all of it. I gestured for us to sit at the kitchen island rather than the more formal dining table. This conversation called for directness, not ceremony. He's been following the news about Barrett Strategic, Joe continued, and apparently Reynolds Trust. He seemed genuinely surprised by your partnership with his parents. I'm sure that was a shock, I acknowledged, unable to suppress a small, satisfied smile. Joe took a contemplative sip of wine. The reason he wanted to see me was about Nicholas Wright. This caught me off guard. Nicholas? What about him? Max claims Nicholas wasn't just involved in the fraud. He was the architect of it. According to Max, Nicholas designed the entire offshore structure and created the dual reporting system years before Max even joined the executive team. I processed this information carefully. That contradicts everything that came out in the investigation and trials. Nicholas received the lightest sentence because he was portrayed as a reluctant participant who eventually did the right thing. Exactly, Joe said. Max claims the authorities got it completely backward. He says Nicholas orchestrated everything, then successfully positioned himself as the whistleblower when he realized the scheme was about to collapse. And we're supposed to believe Max? I asked skeptically. The man has every reason to deflect blame. That's what I thought too, Joe admitted. But he had documentation I'd never seen before. Copies of early planning emails, meeting notes, structure diagrams, all predating his executive role. He's been working with a new lawyer to build a case for appeal based on this evidence. A chill ran through me. If there's any truth to this, Nicholas Wright successfully rehabilitated his image, completed minimal community service, and is now positioning himself as an ethics consultant. Joe finished my thought. While Max serves a 10-year sentence. I moved to the large windows overlooking the city, trying to process this potential shift in everything we thought we knew. Even if this is true, what does Max expect you to do about it? Joe hesitated, and I turned to face him, suddenly alert to something he wasn't saying. Joe? He wants you to help build a public case exposing Nicholas, Joe admitted reluctantly. He believes your agency's credibility on ethics issues, combined with your connection to the original case, would make the accusations impossible to ignore. I stared at him, incredulous. He wants my help? After everything? He knows it's an outrageous request, Joe said. But he also knows the evidence alone might not be enough. The narrative around Nicholas is firmly established, the reformed insider who saw the light. Breaking that narrative would require someone with significant public credibility. Someone like me, I said flatly. Joe nodded. Someone exactly like you. I returned to my seat, mind racing through implications. This is absurd. Even if every word is true, why would I help Max? He anticipated that question, Joe replied. He said to tell you that this isn't about him anymore. It's about justice, the principle you claimed was your motivation all along. The calculated appeal to my integrity was so perfectly aimed that I almost laughed. Even now, Max was thinking several moves ahead, using my own values as leverage. Did he happen to mention how this would affect Reynolds' trust? I asked. If Nicholas was truly the mastermind and is now consulting for major financial institutions, the revelation could trigger another round of investigations and market panic. He did, Joe confirmed. He said his parents have rebuilt enough that they could weather it, that John would want the truth, regardless of short-term consequences. I couldn't argue with that assessment. John Reynolds had demonstrated remarkable commitment to transparency throughout the rebuilding process. I need to think about this, I said finally, and I'd want to see the evidence myself before considering any involvement. I have copies, Joe said, reaching for his briefcase. Max's lawyer provided duplicates. They're expecting some kind of response within the week. As Joe spread documents across my kitchen island, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. Once again, I was being pulled into the orbit of Reynolds' family drama. Once again, financial evidence was laid before me, demanding analysis and response. But this time was fundamentally different. I was no longer the dismissed wife seeking validation. I was a respected professional whose reputation and business could be affected by my choices. I'll need Arlo to authenticate these, I said, examining what appeared to be early planning documents for the offshore structure. And Reagan should review the legal implications of any action we might consider. Joe nodded. I've already asked Arlo to clear her schedule tomorrow. For hours, we combed through Max's evidence, making notes and building timelines. If the documents were genuine, Nicholas Wright had indeed been orchestrating financial fraud at Reynolds Financial for nearly 2 years before recruiting Max as a participant and eventual scapegoat. It's almost elegant, I admitted reluctantly. Nicholas created the perfect setup. He designed the fraud, recruited others including Max to implement it, kept his own hands relatively clean, then positioned himself as the cooperative insider when things started to unravel. While Max, who certainly participated willingly, takes the fall as the primary villain, Joe finished. Dawn was breaking when we finally gathered the documents into organized files. I stood to stretch, my body stiff from hours hunched over complex financial records, an all too familiar posture from the original investigation. What will you do? Joe asked quietly. I gazed out at the city awakening below, weighing options and implications. I need to speak with John first, I decided. Before going any further, he deserves to know what his son is alleging about Nicholas. And if he confirms it's possible? If the evidence holds up? I turned to face Joe, my decision crystallizing. Then Barrett Strategic will develop a strategic communication plan for revealing the truth, not to help Max, but because ethical business practices have been our foundational principle from day one. We can't claim that mantle while allowing Nicholas Wright to continue his deception. Joe studied me for a moment. You know this could have significant blowback. We thought the Reynolds financial chapter of your life was closed." "So did I admitted with a rueful smile. "But perhaps that's the final lesson in all this. There's no clean break from the past, only new ways of engaging with it from a position of greater awareness and strength." As Joe gathered his things to leave, promising to return that evening with Arlo and her technical analysis, I remained by the window, watching the city fully emerge into daylight. 1 year after freeing myself from Max's shadow, I faced a choice about whether to re-engage with his story. The irony wasn't lost on me. But the woman making this decision was fundamentally different from the one who had once sat silently at anniversary dinners, accepting diminishment. This time, if I chose to act, it would be on my terms, for my reasons, with my full agency intact. The symmetry was imperfect but undeniable. Another anniversary dinner might soon be disrupted by unexpected revelations. Only this time, Nicholas Wright would be the one unprepared for what was coming. The Reynolds Trust boardroom fell completely silent after I finished presenting the evidence Joe had obtained from Max. John Reynolds sat motionless at the head of the table, his expression unreadable as he processed the documents suggesting Nicholas Wright had been the architect of the fraud that had destroyed his son's career and nearly ruined the family business. "You've verified the authenticity?" John finally asked, his voice measured. I nodded. Arlo confirmed the digital trail. These emails and planning documents predate Max's executive access by nearly 2 years. The metadata is consistent and shows no signs of manipulation. And the handwritten notes? "We had them analyzed by a forensic document examiner," I replied. "They match Nicholas's handwriting samples from company records." Margaret, who had remained silent throughout my presentation, finally spoke. "If this is true, Nicholas systematically set up Max to take the fall." "Max was hardly an innocent participant," I reminded them gently. "The evidence confirms he eagerly joined and expanded the fraud once brought into it. But yes, it appears Nicholas created the structure and later positioned himself as the reluctant whistleblower." John removed his glasses and pinched the bridge of his nose, a gesture of profound weariness. "Why bring this to us before going public? This directly contradicts the narrative your agency helped establish for Reynolds Trust's rehabilitation." It was a fair question. Barrett Strategic had built its reputation partly on helping Reynolds Trust distance itself from Max's actions. Revealing that Nicholas, now a celebrated reformed insider, was actually the mastermind would reopen wounds that had barely begun to heal. "Because you deserve to make informed decisions," I answered honestly. "This revelation will affect Reynolds Trust, regardless of who breaks the story. I wanted you to have time to prepare." "And Max?" Margaret asked pointedly. "What does he expect to gain?" "A sentence reduction, primarily," I explained. His new legal team believes evidence of Nicholas's larger role could support an appeal for resentencing. He's not expecting exoneration, just more proportional consequences. John stood and walked to the window overlooking the financial district, his reflections visible in the glass. "Nicholas sits on 2 nonprofit boards now. He's advising the SEC on fraud prevention. The narrative of the repentant insider has been thoroughly established. All built on a calculated deception," I noted. "Have you decided whether Barrett Strategic will be involved in exposing this?" John asked, turning back to face me. "That depends partly on this conversation," I admitted. "My agency specializes in ethical communications. If this evidence is solid, and we believe it is, we can't in good conscience allow Nicholas's deception to continue. But we're also sensitive to how this might impact Reynolds Trust." John exchanged a long look with Margaret, an entire conversation passing between them without words. "We rebuilt this company on transparency," he said finally. "If Nicholas Wright deliberately orchestrated this fraud and then manipulated the justice system to minimize his own culpability while maximizing my son's, I want that truth revealed, regardless of short-term consequences to Reynolds Trust." Margaret nodded in agreement. "The company survived the original scandal, It will survive this revelation as well. Their unified stance didn't surprise me. Despite everything, John and Margaret Reynolds had consistently chosen integrity over expedience since the original fraud was exposed. There's something else you should consider, I said carefully. If Max's evidence proves Nicholas was the architect, it raises questions about other players who might have been involved earlier than previously thought. John's gaze sharpened. You're referring to the board members who resigned after the scandal? Yes, I confirmed. The timeline in these documents suggests at least 3 former board members might have had knowledge of the fraud framework before it was fully implemented. This could extend beyond Nicholas, Margaret realized, her expression grim. Potentially, I agreed, which is why how we proceed matters significantly. By the time I left Reynolds Trust headquarters, we had agreed on a coordinated approach. John and Margaret would privately brief their current board and legal team. Meanwhile, Barrett Strategic would develop a comprehensive communications strategy for revealing the truth about Nicholas Wright, not to help Max, but because it was the right thing to do. Back at my agency, I assembled a small, trusted team. Arlo for technical analysis, Reagan for legal guidance, and my 2 senior strategists. For message development, we need absolute discretion, I emphasized as we gathered in the conference room. If Nicholas gets wind of this before we're ready, he'll launch a preemptive campaign to discredit the evidence and our motives. Speaking of motives, Reagan interjected, how do we address the obvious criticism that you're doing this to help your ex-husband? It was the question I'd been wrestling with since first seeing Max's evidence. By being absolutely transparent about the source and our verification process, I replied. We acknowledge Max's self-interest in providing these documents while demonstrating their veracity independently of his claims. We should also prepare for significant backlash, Arlo added. Nicholas has built powerful alliances in the financial community. He'll frame this as a vindictive ex-wife trying to rehabilitate her disgraced husband, which is why timing and control of the narrative are essential, I agreed. We released the evidence and analysis simultaneously to multiple outlets. No exclusives, no advance leaks, just comprehensive documentation that speaks for itself. For the next 2 weeks, we worked methodically, building an airtight case. We created a detailed timeline showing Nicholas's early development of the fraudulent structure. We compiled authenticated communications demonstrating his recruitment of Max and others into the scheme. Most damning, we uncovered evidence of Nicholas's careful self-positioning as the reluctant insider once the scheme began to unravel. 3 days before our planned release, I received an unexpected call from Margaret Reynolds. Nicholas has requested a meeting with John and me, she said without preamble. Tomorrow morning. He claims to have information about irregularities in our current compliance procedures. My pulse quickened. He knows something's coming. Apparently, Margaret confirmed. John is inclined to cancel, but I wonder if there's strategic value in hearing what he has to say. I considered the possibilities. If you meet with him, we need to ensure it's documented. He may try to offer some kind of deal or threaten countermeasures. I'll have our general counsel attend and insist on recording the conversation for compliance purposes, Margaret decided. Nicholas built his rehabilitation on transparency advocacy. He can hardly object. The next day, I waited anxiously, in my office for news of the meeting. When my phone finally rang, it was John Reynolds himself calling. Nicholas offered us a deal, he reported, his voice tight with controlled anger. He proposes to publicly discover problems in his past fraud detection work, taking responsibility for oversight failures that allowed Max's activities to continue undetected longer than they should have. Rewriting history again, I observed. Without admitting his actual role. Exactly, John confirmed. In exchange, he wants us to publicly support his new ethics consulting practice and make him the face of our enhanced compliance efforts. The audacity is almost impressive, I remarked. How did you respond? Margaret asked him directly whether He was concerned about any specific information that might emerge about his past role at Reynolds Financial, John replied. His reaction was illuminating. He immediately became defensive, then suggested that disgruntled former employees might try to distort the historical record to serve their own agendas. He's definitely heard something, I concluded. Did he specifically mention Max? Not by name, John said, but he made a pointed reference to people with nothing to lose trying to rewrite history from prison cells. The confirmation that Nicholas was already preparing counter-narratives cemented my resolve. We need to accelerate our timeline. If he's making preemptive moves, we can't afford to wait. That evening, our team worked through the night, finalizing all materials for immediate release rather than our planned rollout the following week. By dawn, documentation packages were ready for delivery to key financial journalists, regulatory authorities, and legal teams. As I prepared to leave for a series of crucial meetings that would set the revelations in motion, Joe arrived at my office, concern evident in his expression. "You're sure about this?" he asked quietly. "Once we release this evidence, there's no turning back. Nicholas will come after you with everything he has." I met his gaze steadily. A year ago, I exposed Max's betrayal because it was the right thing to do, regardless of personal cost. The principle hasn't changed just because the target has. Joe nodded, understanding. "For what it's worth, I spoke with Max yesterday. He wanted me to tell you that regardless of your decision, he recognizes the position his request put you in." I absorbed this unexpected message thoughtfully. Tell him the truth is worth pursuing for its own sake, not for his benefit or mine. As sunrise cast long shadows across Manhattan's skyscape, I gathered the final documents into my briefcase, preparing to unleash a second financial scandal that would once again reshape multiple lives, including my own. The parallels to the anniversary. Dinner confrontation weren't lost on me. Once again, I carried evidence of betrayal and fraud. Once again, I prepared to challenge a carefully constructed public persona. But this time, I moved forward, not as someone seeking to reclaim her voice, but as someone whose voice already carried weight and influence, a transformation that made all the difference. The financial media erupted 48 hours after we released the evidence against Nicholas Wright. Headlines dominated business news across all platforms. Whistleblower exposed as fraud architect, Nicholas Wright. Mastermind, not informant. Reynolds case. Reopened. New evidence shows deception at highest levels. Nicholas responded exactly as we'd anticipated, with immediate denials followed by attempts to discredit both the evidence and my motives. His hastily arranged press conference projected indignation rather than innocence. These allegations are a transparent attempt by Max Reynolds to deflect blame from his own criminal actions, he declared to assembled reporters. The timing, just as my ethics consultancy launches, reveals the vindictive nature of these fabricated claims. When directly questioned about the authenticated emails and planning documents, Nicholas dismissed them as taken out of context and manipulated to create a false narrative. But financial journalists, armed with our comprehensive timeline and technical verification, pressed harder than he'd expected. "Mr. Wright, these documents bear your digital signature from 2018, nearly 2 years before you claim to have become aware of the fraud. Can you explain that discrepancy?" The Wall Street Journal reporter's question left Nicholas visibly flustered. By day 3, Nicholas's carefully constructed facade began to crumble. Former colleagues, sensing the shifting winds, came forward with corroborating accounts. A junior analyst who had worked under Nicholas revealed being instructed to create the dual reporting system for special client accounts. The SEC announced a formal review of their previous investigation, acknowledging the new evidence raised significant questions about witness testimony and document chronology. On day 5, I received an unexpected call from an unlisted number. When I answered, the prison operator announced, "You have a call from inmate Maxwell Reynolds. Will you accept the charges? After a moment's hesitation, I said yes. Chloe. Max's voice sounded different, the performative confidence replaced by something more subdued. I'm watching what's happening with Nicholas. My lawyer says the SEC investigators were here yesterday. I'm not doing this for you, Max, I said immediately. I know, he replied, surprising me. You're doing it because it's true, but I wanted to thank you anyway. The acknowledgement of my agency and principles, something the old Max would never have recognized, caught me off guard. Nicholas called me yesterday, Max continued. Offered to testify that I pressured him into the fraud if I'd recant the evidence I provided. This was unexpected. What did you tell him? That unlike him, I've accepted responsibility for my actions, that I'm serving my time. He paused. And that you taught me the value of facing consequences honestly. The irony of Max Reynolds claiming to value honesty wasn't lost on me, but I detected something that might actually be genuine growth in his words. My sentence reduction hearing is next month, he added after a moment. My lawyer seems optimistic. That's between you and the court, I replied, maintaining appropriate distance. Of course. Another pause. You've built something impressive. Chloe, Barrett Strategic, the work you're doing with my parents, it's what you deserve. Before I could respond, the operator announced the call time was ending. Goodbye, Max, I said simply. Goodbye, Chloe. The call disconnected, leaving me with complicated emotions I hadn't anticipated. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps something like closure. By the end of the second week, Nicholas Wright's carefully constructed reputation had completely unraveled. His ethics consultancy clients severed ties, nonprofit boards requested his resignation, and the SEC formally reopened their investigation with him as a primary target rather than valued witness. The press eventually came for me as well, questioning whether my involvement was motivated by personal vendetta. I addressed the scrutiny directly in a carefully worded statement. Barrett Strategic became involved in this matter after rigorous verification of evidence showing significant misrepresentation of historical facts. While the source of the initial documents is Mr. Reynolds, our investigation and authentication were conducted independently. Truth and integrity remain our guiding principles, regardless of where that path leads. John and Margaret Reynolds stood firm as well, issuing a joint statement that acknowledged the painful revelations while reaffirming their commitment to transparency. Learning that the fraud that nearly destroyed our family company was more deliberate and orchestrated than previously understood is deeply disturbing. However, we remain committed to facing truth, however difficult, and continuing Reynolds Trust's mission of ethical financial stewardship. 1 month after the revelations, I sat in my office reviewing press coverage that had finally begun to shift from scandal to analysis. The prevailing narrative had evolved from ex-wife's revenge to recognition of the substantial evidence and my agency's professional handling of the matter. Joe entered with 2 coffee cups, setting one on my desk. The SEC just announced formal charges against Nicholas Wright and 2 former board members. They're crediting your evidence package as the catalyst. I took a sip of coffee, processing this latest development. And Max? His resentencing hearing has been scheduled. Based on his cooperation and the new evidence, his lawyers expect a significant reduction. I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor regret, just the quiet certainty that truth had prevailed, regardless of complex personal histories involved. You know, Joe said thoughtfully, most people would have stayed far away from anything connected to their ex-husband. You walked straight back into the fire because it was the right thing to do. I smiled slightly. Not back into the fire. Through it, perhaps, but on my own terms this time. 6 months after Nicholas Wright's exposure, I stood in the auditorium of Columbia Business School, adjusting my notes before addressing the packed Ethics in Business Leadership seminar. Students and faculty had filled every seat, with additional attendees standing along the walls. Ms. Barrett, "We're ready whenever you are," the department chair informed me, gesturing toward the podium. The irony wasn't lost on me. Being invited as an ethics expert when 2 years earlier I had been complicit in my silence, allowing Max's unethical behavior to continue unchecked. Life's trajectories rarely follow predictable paths. "Thank you for joining us today," I began, surveying the attentive faces. "My name is Chloe Barrett, and my journey into business ethics came through an unconventional route, by first failing to uphold them." A ripple of interest moved through the crowd. I had rejected the department's suggested title of whistleblowers. Wisdom in favor of something more honest. Complicity and courage, ethical choices in corporate cultures. Before I founded Barrett Strategic Communications, before I exposed financial fraud at Reynolds Financial Group, I spent years as the silently complicit wife of a man committing securities fraud. I knew something was wrong long before I acted. That uncomfortable truth is where any meaningful discussion of ethics must begin, with our capacity for both moral failure and moral courage, often within the same life story. For the next hour, I shared the unvarnished reality of my experience, not the sanitized version that had become financial media legend, but the messy, complicated truth. I spoke about the gradual erosion of confidence that made me vulnerable to Max's dismissiveness. I acknowledged my initial motivations for gathering evidence being personal rather than ethical, and I discussed the complex aftermath of exposing Nicholas Wright years later, when I had no personal stake beyond commitment to truth. The most dangerous ethical failures don't happen in dramatic moments of obvious choice, I explained. They happen in small compromises, in the silent permission we give others when we don't speak up, in the stories we tell ourselves to justify an action. During the Q&A session, a young woman raised her hand. "How do you respond to critics who say your agency's success is built on your connection to these financial scandals rather than your actual expertise?" The question was direct, but fair. By acknowledging that my experience with the Reynolds case opened doors that might otherwise have remained closed, I replied honestly. But doors opening isn't the same as succeeding once you walk through them. Barrett Strategic has retained clients and grown because our work delivers results, not because of my personal history. As the session concluded, several students approached with business cards and questions. Among them was a young woman who waited until the others had dispersed. "Ms. Barrett, my name is Alexis Reynolds," she said quietly. I studied her face, recognizing Max's eyes and Margaret's poised demeanor. "You're Max's cousin," I realized. "Thomas's daughter." She nodded. "I've been following your career since everything happened. I'm graduating next month with my MBA, and I've been offered a position at Reynolds Trust." "That's wonderful," I replied, genuinely pleased. The Reynolds family's next generation stepping into leadership roles represented healing after so much damage. "My father and Uncle John have different views on my decision," she continued. "Dad thinks I should start somewhere without family complications. Uncle John believes rebuilding the Reynolds legacy is important family work." I considered her unspoken question carefully. "What do you think, Alexis?" "I think—" She paused, choosing her words deliberately, that transforming something damaged into something better might be more meaningful than starting with a clean slate elsewhere. I smiled, recognizing wisdom beyond her years. I would tend to agree. "Would you be willing to meet sometime?" she asked. "To discuss how you navigated the transition from being defined by the Reynolds name to defining yourself on your own terms?" The request touched me unexpectedly. Here was a young woman facing her own version of identity questions I had confronted after leaving Max. How to honor family legacy while establishing personal integrity. "I'd be happy to," I replied, handing her my card. "Have your assistant contact mine." After Alexis left, I gathered my materials and headed toward the exit where Joe waited. We had dinner reservations at a new restaurant in Brooklyn, followed By an exhibition opening at a gallery featuring his sister's photography. Good session? He asked as we walked toward the car. Unexpectedly meaningful, I replied, sharing my conversation with Alexis. It's strange to think that anything positive could emerge from that chapter of my life. Not strange at all, Joe countered thoughtfully. The most powerful transformations often come from our most difficult experiences. That evening, as we enjoyed dinner at a table overlooking the East River, my phone buzzed with an email notification. The subject line caught my attention. Thank you from Federal Correctional Institution. Max's resentencing had reduced his term significantly based on his cooperation in the Nicholas Wright case. He would be eligible for release in 8 months. Everything. Okay? Joe asked, noticing my expression. I showed him the email. Max will be out soon. He's thanking me for restoring truth to the record. Joe studied me carefully. How do you feel about that? I considered the question, searching for the honest answer. Unconcerned, I realized. 2 years ago, the idea of Max being free would have terrified me, either because I feared him or because I hadn't fully escaped his influence. Now it's just information. He'll have his life, I have mine. That's significant, Joe observed. Complete emotional independence. Later that night, as we walked along the promenade, the Manhattan skyline glittering across the water, I reflected on the unexpected paths my life had taken. From dismissed corporate wife to whistleblower, from vindicated truth-teller to respected business leader, each role building on the previous, none defining me completely. What are you thinking about? Joe asked as we paused to look at the view. Legacy, I replied. How we never really know which of our actions will matter most in the end. The most meaningful consequence of exposing Max wasn't the justice served or my business success. Perhaps it was this moment of unexpected mentorship with a young Reynolds woman seeking to build something honorable from a complicated family history. Every ending creates space for new beginnings, sometimes in ways we could never anticipate. 18. Months after my Columbia lecture, I stood in the reception area of Barrett Strategic's expanded offices, greeting clients and industry colleagues at our 3rd anniversary celebration. The firm had grown to 32 employees across 3 departments: crisis management, ethical brand development, and our newest division, women's leadership communications. Quite different from last year's celebration, Reagan observed, joining me as I surveyed the crowded space. Her recent appointment as a federal judge had been announced the previous week, marking another milestone in her impressive career. Growth brings good challenges, I agreed. The agency had doubled its client roster and opened a small London office. Success had arrived not through clever marketing, but through consistent results and unwavering commitment to ethical communication practices. Across the room, Margaret Reynolds was deep in conversation with 2 corporate clients. Her transition from Reynolds family matriarch to respected ethics communicator had been remarkably successful, bringing gravitas and insider perspective to our financial sector work. Have you seen the latest Fortune profile? Arlo asked, appearing with her tablet. The headline read, Barrett Strategic, Building an Ethics Empire from Scandal's Ashes. They're still leading with the Reynolds connection, I noted, skimming the article. But at least the substance focuses on our actual work. 3 years is nothing in media narrative time, Arlo reminded me pragmatically. Give it another 2, and they'll lead with your industry innovations instead. The elevator doors opened, and Alexis Reynolds entered with her father Thomas. After our mentorship conversations, she had indeed joined Reynolds Trust, already making her mark with initiatives, connecting ethical investment practices to climate responsibility. Chloe, Thomas greeted me warmly, a significant change from the awkward interactions that had followed my divorce from Max. Remarkable gathering. John sends his regrets. Board meeting in London. I understand completely, I assured him. John Reynolds had gradually stepped back from daily operations at Reynolds Trust, though he remained board chairman and an occasional strategic advisor to Barrett Strategic. As I circulated among guests, I was approached by a reporter from the key Wall Street Journal who had covered both Reynolds scandals. "Any comment on Maxwell Reynolds' new position?" he asked without preamble. The question caught me off guard. I wasn't aware he had one. The reporter looked surprised. "The announcement? Went out this morning. He's joining the Financial Integrity Project as a consultant on fraud prevention." I absorbed this information without visible reaction. After Max's release, he had maintained a low profile, occasionally speaking at compliance seminars but largely staying out of public view. This new role represented a significant step into professional rehabilitation. "I wish him success in contributing positively to the field," I replied diplomatically. After the reporter moved on, Joe appeared at my side. "You heard about Max?" I nodded. "Interesting career choice." "The Financial Integrity Project is legitimate," Joe acknowledged. "They've done important work on regulatory reform." "Then I hope he adds value," I said simply. What remained unspoken between us was the evolution this moment represented. 2 years earlier, news of Max rebuilding his career might have triggered concern or resentment. Now it was merely information about someone who occupied an increasingly distant part of my past. As I prepared to deliver remarks to our gathered guests, I caught sight of my reflection in the glass walls of our conference room. The woman looking back at me, confident, accomplished, defined by her own choices rather than her relationship to a powerful man, had been there all along, waiting for the chance to emerge. "Thank you all for celebrating with us tonight," I began, raising my glass. 3 years ago, Barrett Strategic was founded on a simple premise: that truth matters, that how we communicate reveals who we are, and that ethical leadership isn't just right, it's sustainable. As applause filled the room, I silently acknowledged how completely the narrative had shifted. From Max's anniversary toast dismissing me as someone who couldn't tell a balance sheet from a bedsheet, to leading a thriving agency specializing in ethical communication. The most powerful reclamation wasn't exposing betrayal, but building something meaningful in its aftermath. 5 years to the day after the anniversary dinner that changed everything, I found myself once again at La Maison Azur. The restaurant had changed ownership, undergone renovations, but still maintained its reputation as one of the city's premier dining establishments. This time, however, I wasn't entering as Max Reynolds' underestimated wife, but as the keynote speaker for the Women in Business Leadership Gala being held in the same sapphire room where my marriage had publicly ended. "Ms. Barrett, this way, please." The event coordinator guided me through the main dining area. "We have a few minutes before your introduction." As I entered the familiar private dining room, now transformed with different lighting and decor, memories washed over me. The tension of that night, the shocked faces, the moment everything changed. But they felt distant now, like scenes from someone else's life. The coordinator left me alone for a moment of preparation. I moved to the windows overlooking the city, the same view I had contemplated 5 years earlier while waiting for my then-husband to arrive and face exposure. "Full circle?" came Joe's voice as he joined me by the window. I smiled, taking his hand. "More like a spiral. Same location, completely different elevation. Tonight I wasn't here to end something, but to inspire." Barrett Strategic had become an industry leader, with offices in 3 countries and a client list that included major corporations committed to ethical transformation. My book on ethical leadership had spent 20 weeks on the bestseller list, and my speaking calendar was booked a year in advance. "They're ready for you," the coordinator announced, returning to the room. Joe squeezed my hand. "I'll be at our table." As I approached the podium, surveying the room filled with accomplished women and supportive allies, I felt a profound appreciation for the journey that had brought me here. 5 years ago, I stood in this very room and found my voice. I began, watching recognition dawn on some faces as they made the connection. Not for the first time. I'd always been articulate. But for the first time with complete authenticity and without fear of diminishment. The audience leaned forward, engaged by the personal revelation. What I discovered that night wasn't just the power of speaking truth, but the importance of how we respond when life reveals our own complicity in dynamics that diminish us. Whether in personal relationships or professional environments, we all face moments that define us, not by what happens to us, but by how we choose to move forward. I spoke for 30 minutes about leadership, ethics, and the particular challenges women face in male-dominated industries. I shared strategies, research, and personal insights gained through building Barrett Strategic. But the most powerful moment came during the Q&A when a young executive asked what I considered my greatest accomplishment. Not exposing fraud, not building a successful agency, not writing a bestseller, I answered without hesitation. My greatest accomplishment was reclaiming my own narrative, learning to define myself by my choices rather than by my relationship to someone else's power. As applause filled the room, I caught sight of my reflection in the window, strong, centered, authentic. The woman I had always been beneath the accommodating smile and careful self-editing. The journey from that anniversary dinner to tonight hadn't been linear or easy. It had required facing painful truths about myself as well as others. But standing here, 5 years later, I understood with absolute clarity that the most important revelation hadn't been exposing Max's betrayal. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.